Elizabeth Keckley rose before daylight, as she had for most of her life. The room she rented on 12th Street held the chill of late winter, the kind that settled into the bones and lingered even after the small coal stove was lit. She dressed without haste, her movements practiced and economical. There was no one to witness her routines, no one to accommodate. The day would proceed whether she was ready or not. Her hands, already stiff, were the first thing she examined each morning. She did this not out of vanity but necessity. They were her living. The scars along the knuckles and the faint pale lines across the backs of her fingers were old and unmoving, but the joints ached in damp weather. She flexed them slowly until the pain dulled into something manageable. There were garments to finish, fittings to conduct, measurements to record. Time, once lost, was not recovered. The dressmaking rooms below were orderly, clean, and deliberately modest. Bolts of fabric were arranged by weight and color. Tools were returned to their places at the end of each day. Nothing was left out that might suggest disorder or excess. Respectability, Elizabeth had learned, was not assumed for a woman like her. It had to be demonstrated continually through restraint, silence, and exacting work. The city beyond her windows was changing, though she rarely spoke of it. Washington had once moved at a slower pace, its ambitions limited, its streets half-finished. Now it strained under the weight of arriving men and materials, soldiers and clerks and petitioners. Wagons clogged the roads, new boarding houses rose beside older homes. Coal smoke settled into the air and did not lift. The river carried more traffic than it ever had, and with it, refuse and sickness. Elizabeth's shop smelled faintly of lavender and starch. She kept it that way with care. The scent suggested cleanliness, calm, and gentility. It was meant to reassure the women who entered that this space, though owned and operated by a colored woman, met their expectations of refinement. They rarely remarked on the effort, but they noticed when it failed. Her assistants arrived quietly, greeting her with nods and subdued voices. They were young women, some free-born, some not long removed from bondage. Elizabeth did not ask for their histories. She knew them well enough without names for their suffering. She paid them fairly when she could, expected precision, and tolerated no gossip within the shop. Words, she believed, were dangerous when allowed to wander. The work itself was steady and demanding. Morning dresses required one kind of attention, evening gowns another. There were hems to be adjusted by a fraction, bodices altered to accommodate changing figures, sleeves reshaped to follow the fashion plates arriving from Europe. Elizabeth read those plates carefully, not for ornament, but instruction. Taste was not a matter of preference. It was a language spoken by power. Clients came and went throughout the day. Most were white women of means, wives of men whose names appeared regularly in the newspapers. They entered without acknowledgement of the space itself or the labor that sustained it. They spoke freely in Elizabeth's presence, assuming her deaf to implication and intention. She accepted this as part of the arrangement. Listening had once been a requirement for survival. Now it was an occupational hazard. She knelt when necessary, chalk in hand, eyes level with silk skirts and polished boots. From that vantage, she heard conversations about politics, about secession, about the instability of the country and the inconvenience it posed to social life. Some spoke of war as if it were a distant spectacle, regrettable but manageable. Others spoke with more fear, voices lowered, glances cast toward the door. Elizabeth did not respond. Her face remained neutral. She placed pins with care, never drawing blood unless it was her own. In the evenings, after the last fitting, she remained at her work table while the assistants departed. The lamplight strained her eyes, but she did not stop. Fabric did not forgive delay, nor did creditors. She had learned long ago that security was temporary, always subject to revision. A woman who had once been owned did not forget how easily circumstances changed. Her freedom, purchased years earlier at great cost, was a fact she acknowledged without celebration. It did not shield her from insult or suspicion. It did not prevent men from speaking to her sharply or women from addressing her as if she were an extension of the furniture. Freedom, she had learned, was not relief. It was responsibility without protection. She kept accounts in a small ledger, written neatly in ink she diluted to make it last longer. Each expense was recorded. Each payment received was noted. She trusted numbers more than people. They did not flatter, and they did not lie. At night, when the city finally quieted, she allowed herself a moment of stillness. She did not dwell on memory unless it intruded. There were places she did not return to, even in thought. Dwelling had once been dangerous. It remained so. It was during one such evening, the air heavy with expectation and rumor, that she read of the election. The newspaper lay open on her work table, its print smudged by handling. The name of the president-elect appeared repeatedly, surrounded by commentary that ranged from disbelief to contempt. Elizabeth read it carefully, once, then again. She folded the paper and set it aside. The significance of the event was clear enough. The consequences were not. She had lived long enough to understand that change announced in print did not always arrive intact. Often it came fractured, delayed, or reversed entirely. She did not allow herself hope. Hope required trust. Elizabeth Keckley did not mark the beginning of her work for Mrs. Lincoln with ceremony. There was no entry in her ledger that distinguished the commissions from any other. The fabrics were finer, the demands more numerous, but the work itself followed familiar laws. Cloth resisted or yielded, thread held or failed. A body could be shaped only so far before seams betrayed the strain. Her first visit to the executive mansion took place on a grey morning in early March. The city had not yet decided whether winter would release its hold. Mud clung to boots. The air carried the smell of damp stone and coal smoke. She walked the distance rather than hire a carriage. Habit guided her steps, and caution, arriving under her own power, preserved a measure of dignity she was unwilling to surrender. The building was less imposing than its reputation suggested. Its paint was weathered. Its halls were crowded. Men moved through the rooms with papers tucked under arms, hats in hand, voices raised in impatience or calculation. Elizabeth waited where she was directed, standing near a wall, her parcel of fabric held close. No one acknowledged her presence. This was not unusual. She had long ago learned that attention often arrived only when one disrupted expectations. When she was finally escorted upstairs, the transition was abrupt. Noise diminished. Carpets softened footsteps. Doors closed. The private rooms were warmer, quieter, and arranged with a mixture of comfort and disorder. Furniture had been shifted and reshifted. New draperies hung beside older pieces that had not yet been replaced. The effect was unsettled, as if nothing had been allowed to remain long enough to settle. Mrs. Lincoln greeted her with urgency rather than courtesy. Measurements were taken quickly. Instructions were delivered in bursts. Colors were rejected and reconsidered within the same breath. Elizabeth listened, recorded, and made no objection. She understood that authority often announced itself through impatience. Resistance would serve no purpose. It became clear within the first hour that the household operated under pressures not acknowledged publicly. Servants moved with caution, pausing when voices rose behind closed doors. Requests were made, then countermanded. Deliveries arrived without clear destination. Bills were discussed in whispers and then hidden from view. Elizabeth observed without comment. Observation was not intervention. It did not require permission. The first injustice she noted was small and easily dismissed. A fitting was interrupted by a gentleman who entered without announcement. He spoke to Mrs. Lincoln as if Elizabeth were not present, commenting freely on the appearance of the gown, questioning its cost, its necessity. When Elizabeth adjusted a seam, he stepped back as if startled, his face tightening. He said nothing to her. He said nothing about her. His silence was a dismissal. Later, as Elizabeth gathered her tools, she overheard a servant reprimanded sharply for a delay that had not been his doing. The blame was assigned downward, without inquiry. Elizabeth recognized the pattern. Power did not explain itself, it corrected. On subsequent visits, these patterns multiplied. Mrs. Lincoln's moods shifted rapidly. Praise was offered generously one moment and withdrawn the next. Requests became expectations. Expectations hardened into demands. When Elizabeth explained that a particular alteration would require more fabric or more time, the explanation was received as reluctance. "You will find a way," Mrs. Lincoln said on more than one occasion. The phrase carried weight. It assumed compliance as a given. Elizabeth found a way because she always had. She adjusted her schedule. She worked later hours. She used remnants more carefully, aligning grain and pattern with painstaking care. The result satisfied the eye, if not the accounts. Payment was discussed vaguely. Sums were mentioned and then deferred. Elizabeth did not press. She had learned that pressing could be interpreted as insolence. She recorded what she could and trusted that resolution would follow. It usually did, though not promptly. Beyond the private rooms, the atmosphere of the city worsened. Soldiers filled the streets in greater numbers. Their uniforms were new, their expressions uncertain. Drills took place on open ground where children once played. Hospitals were prepared in buildings not intended for such use. The sound of wagons carrying supplies became constant. In the newspapers, language hardened. Accusations replaced arguments. Loyalty was questioned. Neutrality was treated as suspicion. Elizabeth read carefully and spoke little. She had lived under systems where loyalty was demanded but never rewarded. She understood that declarations of allegiance did not guarantee protection. Within the executive mansion, fear took quieter forms. Mrs. Lincoln spoke often of enemies. Some were named, others remained undefined. She expressed resentment toward women who criticized her clothing while ignoring the strain of her position. She spoke of isolation, of betrayal, of being watched. Elizabeth listened without affirming or denying. During one fitting, Mrs. Lincoln's hand trembled noticeably. She blamed the room's chill. Elizabeth said nothing and adjusted the bodice to accommodate the movement. The trembling did not cease. It was during these early weeks that Elizabeth first understood the imbalance of her position. She was granted access without authority. She was trusted without protection. Her presence was useful, but her status remained unchanged. She was inside and outside simultaneously, included for convenience and excluded by design. The injustice did not announce itself through violence. It arrived through assumption, through the expectation that her labor would expand to fill whatever gap appeared, through the certainty that discretion could be demanded without compensation, through the understanding that if conflict arose, her account would carry less weight. One afternoon, as Elizabeth prepared to leave, Mrs. Lincoln detained her. The request was framed as a confidence. The tone shifted. The room grew still. "You hear many things," Mrs. Lincoln said. "You see more than most." Elizabeth inclined her head slightly. It was neither agreement nor denial. "I trust you," Mrs. Lincoln continued. "I must trust someone." The statement was not an offer, it was an assignment. Elizabeth accepted it without verbal acknowledgement. Refusal was not a viable option. She understood that trust, when offered from above, often came with obligation rather than safety. After that day, conversations changed. Words were chosen with care, then spoken anyway. The presence of Elizabeth no longer inhibited discussion. It facilitated it. She was addressed directly when reassurance was needed, indirectly when decisions were made. She heard arguments about money, about appointments, about the strain of appearances. She heard references to correspondence that must not be shown. She heard complaints about Congress, about generals, about the press. None of it was intended for her, yet none of it was withheld. Elizabeth did not record these details. She stored them where she had always stored such things. Memory had once been her only defense. It remained so. The injustice deepened when expectations extended beyond her trade. She was asked to carry messages that were not written, to recall conversations that others preferred to forget, to remain present during moments of distress without reacting. Emotional labor was extracted as surely as physical work. On one occasion, a delay in a delivery prompted sharp words. Mrs. Lincoln's voice rose. Accusations were made. Elizabeth stood still, hands folded, eyes lowered. When the outburst passed, no apology followed. None was expected. Elizabeth left that day with her chest tight and her jaw set. She did not allow herself anger. Anger consumed energy better spent elsewhere. Instead, she adjusted her boundaries inward. She resolved to remember precisely what was asked of her and what was not offered in return. Fear spread quietly through the household as spring progressed. Not fear of immediate harm, but fear of exposure, of error, of judgment. Servants whispered. Doors closed more often. The sound of footsteps in corridors prompted glances and pauses. Elizabeth's role solidified without formal acknowledgement. She became a constant presence, summoned regularly, relied upon implicitly. Her invisibility became a convenience others depended upon. The injustice lay not in cruelty, but in presumption, in the certainty that her silence was owed, in the absence of recognition for the risk she assumed simply by being present. By the time the city erupted into open war, Elizabeth understood that she had crossed an unmarked line. She was no longer merely a dressmaker serving an influential client. She was a witness to a private world governed by fear and imbalance. She continued her work with the same care she always had. She adjusted seams, she met deadlines, she listened. The injustice did not yet demand response. It accumulated quietly like pressure beneath a sealed lid. By the summer of that year, the city no longer pretended to be anything other than a place at war. Washington filled itself with uniforms, with horses and wagons, with men who spoke in clipped phrases and carried documents stamped with seals that meant life or death to someone not present. The streets were louder, the nights shorter. Even in the private rooms of the executive mansion, the war pressed in, shaping every decision, every silence. Elizabeth Keckley's visits increased in frequency. What had begun as regular fittings became near-daily summons. There were always reasons: a reception announced on short notice, a dress found suddenly unsuitable, morning attire required with urgency and no explanation. Elizabeth learned not to ask. Questions slowed the work and invited irritation. The First Lady's expectations hardened into routine. Elizabeth was expected to arrive promptly, regardless of weather or fatigue. She was expected to remain until dismissed, even when hours passed without instruction. She was expected to adapt without comment when circumstances changed. None of this was stated directly. It was understood. Within the household, authority narrowed. Decisions that had once involved several voices were now made quickly, often unilaterally. Servants who questioned instructions were replaced or reassigned. Those who remained learned to comply first and inquire later, if at all. Elizabeth noted the change without surprise. She had seen authority tighten before. In times of uncertainty, those with power rarely loosened their grip. They demanded order where none could be guaranteed. The war brought with it new visitors, many of whom did not appear on any schedule. Men arrived late in the evening and departed before dawn. Their names were not announced. Their conversations were conducted in low tones, doors closed. Elizabeth sometimes waited in adjoining rooms, her work paused, her presence tolerated but unacknowledged. She learned the rhythm of these interruptions: a knock, a pause, the hush that followed. When voices rose, they did so in anger or fear, never confidence. When laughter appeared, it was brief and brittle. Mrs. Lincoln spoke more openly as the months passed. Isolation sharpened her need to speak, and Elizabeth provided a listening presence that asked nothing in return. Complaints about criticism became more frequent. The newspapers, the wives of other officials, members of Congress. Everyone, it seemed, watched her closely, measuring her behavior against standards she had never agreed to but was expected to meet. "They will never forgive me for being who I am," Mrs. Lincoln said more than once. The statement carried bitterness rather than self-pity. Elizabeth listened and continued her work. Money entered these conversations more often. At first, it appeared obliquely: references to merchants waiting on payment, to misunderstandings with suppliers, to accounts that required adjustment. Elizabeth did not comment. She had no authority over household finances, nor any desire to appear knowledgeable in that regard. Still, the pressure was evident. Requests for gowns multiplied even as appropriations were delayed. Elizabeth was asked to work with materials already used, to alter rather than replace. She complied, though she understood the limits of such measures. Fabric bore memory, seams left traces. One afternoon, a disagreement erupted in her presence. Mrs. Lincoln spoke sharply to a clerk over an unpaid invoice. The clerk attempted explanation. He was dismissed abruptly. The door closed harder than necessary. Elizabeth stood quietly, holding a length of black silk. She felt the tension settle into the room like dust. Afterward, Mrs. Lincoln spoke rapidly, as if justifying herself to the air. The merchants, she said, exaggerated. The delays were temporary. Everyone expected perfection without acknowledging the constraints placed upon her. Elizabeth offered no response beyond a nod. She understood that agreement was not being sought. Endurance was. Outside the mansion, the war's effects deepened. Hospitals filled. The sound of ambulance wagons became common. Soldiers with missing limbs appeared in the streets, moving slowly, watched, and then ignored. The optimism of the early months had faded. The war no longer resembled an idea. It had become a presence. Elizabeth's own life narrowed. Her shop on 12th Street remained open, but her time there diminished. Assistants managed daily operations under her instruction. She trusted them, though she worried. A business left unattended too often developed weaknesses. She slept less. When she did sleep, it was lightly. The combination of long hours, emotional strain, and the constant awareness of being observed took its toll. She did not speak of it. Complaints were not currency she could afford. Pressure built not through overt threat, but accumulation. Each confidence shared added weight. Each private moment witnessed increased her vulnerability. She was no longer merely a service provider. She had become a silent participant in a world governed by secrecy and imbalance. The rules within that world tightened gradually. Conversations stopped when unfamiliar staff entered rooms. Doors were locked more frequently. Papers were burned rather than stored. Elizabeth noticed these details because she was trained to notice. Survival had once depended upon it. Mrs. Lincoln's demeanor shifted between agitation and exhaustion. There were days when she spoke incessantly, packing the room, hands twisting fabric as Elizabeth worked. There were others when she sat motionless, staring ahead, responding only when directly addressed. On those days, Elizabeth adjusted garments without comment, her presence steady and unobtrusive. During one such fitting, Mrs. Lincoln spoke suddenly of her family, of brothers who had chosen the other side, of letters received and then destroyed, of the impossibility of pleasing anyone in a divided nation. Her voice tightened as she spoke, and Elizabeth could hear the effort required to maintain control. Elizabeth understood division. She had lived within it. She did not offer counsel. Advice was dangerous. It implied equality that did not exist. The president himself appeared more frequently in the private rooms. His presence altered the atmosphere immediately. Conversations ceased or redirected. His manner toward Elizabeth was polite, distant, and brief. He acknowledged her work without engaging her as a person. This, too, was expected. Elizabeth observed changes in him as well: weight loss, lines deepening around the eyes, moments of stillness that suggested mental withdrawal. She saw him pause before speaking, as if measuring the cost of words. She saw him read casualty lists with an expression that did not change. Once late in the evening, he entered the room while Elizabeth was working. He did not notice her at first. He spoke to his wife in a low voice, expressing doubt, frustration, weariness. Elizabeth stood still, her needle suspended, her presence forgotten. She listened because she could not leave. The pressure of that moment settled heavily upon her. She was hearing thoughts not meant for record. She was carrying knowledge without permission. There was no way to refuse such burdens once acquired. As the year progressed, the lines of authority sharpened further. The press grew more hostile. Accusations multiplied. Mrs. Lincoln responded with defensiveness rather than retreat. Her need for control intensified. Purchases increased despite criticism. Elizabeth saw invoices she wished she had not seen, figures that did not align with public statements. She did not confront these discrepancies. Confrontation required leverage. She had none. The expectations placed upon her extended subtly beyond her role. She was asked to remember who had been present during certain meetings, to confirm whether particular individuals had visited on certain days. These requests were framed casually, but Elizabeth understood their significance. Memory was being conscripted. She answered carefully, truthfully, and minimally. She did not embellish. She did not volunteer. The pressure narrowed her options. To withdraw abruptly would raise suspicion. To remain meant continued exposure. There was no path that did not involve risk. Elizabeth measured her responses as she measured fabric, allowing for strain, anticipating stress points. She maintained her composure, her professionalism, her silence. These were her tools. By the time the war's second year began, she understood that the space she occupied was no longer neutral. It was contested ground, shaped by fear, ambition, and secrecy. The injustice she faced was no longer merely assumption. It was entrapment by proximity. Rules had tightened, control had increased, options had narrowed. Elizabeth continued to work. She had learned long ago that survival often depended not on resistance, but on endurance. The winter settled over Washington without ceremony. It arrived as cold did in that city, seeping through walls and settling into corridors never meant to be warmed evenly. The executive mansion grew drafty and dim. Fires burned constantly, yet the chill remained. The river slowed. Streets hardened under frozen mud. The war did not pause for weather, and neither did the demands placed upon those inside the house that governed it. Elizabeth Keckley continued her visits, though the work had changed in character. Where there had once been variety, there was now repetition. Black dresses, black ribbons, black gloves, mourning attire, requested before any public announcement justified it. Elizabeth did not question the timing. She had learned that preparation often preceded explanation. The household moved with a subdued urgency. Voices were lower, footsteps were cautious. Even the president's schedule, once erratic, took on a grim regularity shaped by reports from the front. Elizabeth saw less of him now, though when he did appear, his presence carried more weight. He spoke little. When he did, his words were measured and spare. Mrs. Lincoln's condition worsened as the winter progressed. Her agitation sharpened. She slept poorly and spoke of exhaustion without resting. Elizabeth observed the signs without remark. She was not a physician, nor was she invited to be anything other than what she was. Yet the line between professional duty and personal witness continued to blur. In early February, illness entered the private rooms. At first it was spoken of casually, dismissed as a passing discomfort. A child's fever, nothing more. Elizabeth continued her work, adjusting garments while servants moved more quickly than usual, carrying water, linens, medicines. The fever did not break. Within days, the tone changed. Doctors arrived at all hours. Their expressions were grave, though they spoke cautiously. Elizabeth heard unfamiliar terms, discussions of humors and treatments that involved leeches, purges, and tinctures. None of it seemed to help. Elizabeth found herself summoned not for fittings, but for presence. She stood in rooms thick with the smell of illness, holding fabric she did not unfold. Her hands were idle, her attention fixed. She had been called because she was steady, because she did not collapse when grief appeared. The child's cries weakened, then ceased. Silence followed, broken only by whispered consultations and the soft movement of feet. Mrs. Lincoln's composure fractured visibly. She paced. She wept. She clutched Elizabeth's arm without apology or explanation. Elizabeth did not pull away. The night the child died, the house crossed into a different state of being. The sound that emerged from Mrs. Lincoln was not language. It was not speech. It was a sound Elizabeth recognized without having heard it before. She had known it existed. She had lived among women who carried it silently. The president arrived and took his wife into his arms. Elizabeth watched from the edge of the room, unseen and uninvited, yet unable to leave. The child's body lay still, diminished by illness. The room felt smaller than it had hours earlier. No instruction was given to Elizabeth, yet she remained. She handed cloth when asked. She fetched water. She stood where she would not obstruct. She absorbed what others could not afford to see. Afterward, the house fell into a controlled disorder. Arrangements were made quickly and quietly. Curtains were drawn. Appointments were cancelled. Messages were sent. The machinery of mourning engaged without pause. Elizabeth's role changed irrevocably that night. She was no longer merely adjacent to grief. She was embedded within it. Mrs. Lincoln clung to her with desperation that did not acknowledge boundaries. Elizabeth became an anchor by default, her steadiness mistaken for inexhaustibility. In the days that followed, Mrs. Lincoln refused to enter certain rooms. She refused to eat. She refused consolation from anyone not already within her narrow circle. Elizabeth was summoned repeatedly, sometimes only to sit in silence. The president bore his grief differently. He returned to his duties with a visible effort that left him diminished. Elizabeth saw him stand at windows for long periods, unmoving. She saw him rub his eyes with the heel of his hand, as if trying to erase something. The line that had been crossed was not public. It was internal. It altered how authority functioned within the House. Decisions were made hastily or deferred indefinitely. Mrs. Lincoln's suspicions intensified. She accused servants of negligence. She questioned doctors' motives. She spoke of fate and enemies with equal certainty. Elizabeth listened and absorbed. She did not contradict. Contradiction would have been cruel and possibly dangerous. The war outside continued without regard for the family's loss. Reports arrived daily. Casualty lists lengthened. The juxtaposition was stark. Private grief unfolded alongside public catastrophe. The house contained both, without adequate separation. Elizabeth found herself carrying messages that were not written. She was asked to recall details of conversations that others preferred to forget. She was asked whether certain individuals had been present at certain times. The questions were careful, but the implications were clear. Memory was being interrogated. She answered honestly, narrowly. She did not speculate. Mrs. Lincoln's reliance on her deepened into something that resembled possession. Elizabeth was expected to be available at all hours. Her own needs became irrelevant. Her shop suffered. Assistants complained quietly of delayed instructions and unanswered questions. Elizabeth acknowledged their concerns and offered reassurance she was not certain she could fulfill. The injustice sharpened after the death. Sympathy for Mrs. Lincoln did not translate into leniency for those around her. Outbursts became more frequent. Accusations were made without evidence. Elizabeth absorbed the strain because she could. Others could not. She began to understand that her silence was now more than professional discretion. It was a form of containment. She held what others could not. She bore witness without recourse. The boundary between service and exploitation dissolved further. Elizabeth was asked to stay through the night. She was asked to manage situations that exceeded her role. She was asked to remember, to forget, to reassure. The line had been crossed because there was no longer a clear path back. The intimacy forged through tragedy could not be undone. The knowledge acquired could not be relinquished. Elizabeth recognized the danger even as she accepted the necessity. To withdraw now would be interpreted as abandonment. To remain meant continued exposure to instability and blame. She chose to remain. Not out of loyalty, though loyalty was expected of her, not out of ambition, but because leaving would have required an assertion of agency she knew would not be respected. The winter passed slowly. The house never fully recovered its equilibrium. Something essential had broken and could not be repaired. Elizabeth continued to work in rooms heavy with loss. She adjusted mourning dresses. She listened to accusations. She witnessed grief that did not resolve, only shifted. The war ground on. The nation's suffering expanded. Inside the executive mansion, the consequences of that one death continued to ripple outward, reshaping relationships and tightening control. Elizabeth understood that what she had seen could never be unseen. What she had heard could never be unremembered. The line had been crossed, and there was no return. The spring that followed did not restore balance. It brought light back into the rooms and softened the air, but nothing else eased. The household moved forward because it had to, not because it had recovered. Grief did not end. It settled into habits. Elizabeth Keckley adjusted to this new state with the same discipline that had carried her through other irreversible changes. She did not expect improvement. She expected continuation. Mrs. Lincoln emerged from her seclusion unevenly. Some days she received visitors, spoke at length, issued instructions with renewed energy. Other days she remained behind closed doors, sending for Elizabeth repeatedly, only to dismiss her without explanation. Elizabeth learned not to interpret these shifts. Interpretation invited error. What changed was not the volume of secrets, but their weight. They no longer arrived as fragments overheard or remarks made in agitation. They came deliberately, as if Mrs. Lincoln needed to deposit them somewhere outside herself. Elizabeth became that place. She listened as Mrs. Lincoln spoke of debts more openly now, of bills that could no longer be deferred, of merchants who pressed harder with each passing week. She spoke of Congress with resentment, of scrutiny she considered unfair, of men who judged her without understanding the cost of her position. Elizabeth did not dispute these claims. She did not affirm them either. Her resistance took a quieter form, she remembered. She began, without writing, to order events carefully in her mind. Dates, names, sequences, not to expose them, but to preserve them. Memory was the only domain she controlled entirely. No one could seize it, though many could try to shape it. She noticed how often Mrs. Lincoln contradicted herself, not from deceit, but confusion. She noted which explanations changed and which remained fixed. She observed which fears repeated themselves. Patterns emerged where chaos had seemed to reign. This act of observation was her resistance. It was not defiance, it was clarity. The war pressed closer, hospitals overflowed. Black crepe appeared in windows throughout the city. Elizabeth passed wounded men in the streets, some walking with assistance, others carried. She did not look away. Looking away had never protected anyone. Within the executive mansion, routines tightened. Security increased. Access narrowed. Elizabeth was permitted where others were not, yet this permission came without acknowledgement of the risk it carried. Her presence made her visible to those who resented Mrs. Lincoln and invisible to those who would have defended her. She understood that she occupied a dangerous middle ground, too close to power to be dismissed as irrelevant, too far removed to be defended as essential. Her quiet resistance extended to restraint. When asked questions framed to elicit speculation, she answered factually or not at all. When encouraged to confirm suspicions, she redirected attention to the work at hand. She did not add to the fire, even when doing so might have earned favor. This restraint cost her. Mrs. Lincoln occasionally mistook it for judgment. There were moments when her tone sharpened, when she accused Elizabeth of withholding sympathy. Elizabeth accepted these accusations without reply. She had learned long ago that defending oneself in such circumstances often worsened the outcome. She resisted in another way as well. She maintained her standards. Even as demands increased and payment remained uncertain, she did not allow her work to decline. Precision became an assertion of self. Each invisible stitch was a refusal to be diminished. Her shop suffered in her absence. She visited when she could, issuing instructions, settling disputes, reassuring clients who complained of delays. Some understood, others did not. A few took their business elsewhere. Elizabeth recorded these losses without comment. She had survived worse. At night, when she was alone, she allowed herself moments of reflection she did not permit during the day. She considered the position she now occupied, how it had been shaped by choices not entirely her own. She acknowledged the danger without dramatizing it. Fear, she knew, did not require embellishment. She did not write. Writing fixed things in ways that memory did not. Fixed things could be seized, misinterpreted, used. Memory remained flexible, responsive. It could be guarded. Mrs. Lincoln's reliance on her intensified. There were evenings when Elizabeth was asked to remain long after her work was complete, simply to sit. Silence filled the room. Mrs. Lincoln spoke sporadically, then fell quiet again. Elizabeth remained still, her presence a stabilizing force she did not claim credit for. During one such evening, Mrs. Lincoln spoke of enemies within the government, of betrayal close at hand. She named no one directly, but the implications were clear. Elizabeth listened and stored the information without reacting. She did not validate the fear nor dismiss it. Either response would have shaped events in ways she could not predict. This, too, was resistance, refusing to be the instrument of another's paranoia. Elizabeth understood that she could not prevent injustice outright. She did not possess that power, but she could limit its reach by refusing to amplify it. She could preserve truth internally, even if she could not release it. The war continued to narrow choices for everyone. Men were conscripted, families were divided, the future contracted into immediate survival. Elizabeth watched these changes from a vantage that offered no authority and no refuge. Her quiet resistance was not heroic. It did not alter the course of events. It did not protect her from eventual consequence. It was simply the refusal to surrender her internal order to external chaos. She continued to observe, to remember, to measure. She did not speak more than necessary. She did not forget what she had seen. In this way, she resisted erasure. The silence she maintained was not emptiness, it was deliberate, it held weight. And it was becoming heavier. You are not a cinematic writer, marketer, or modern storyteller. You are a historical reconstruction narrator. Your role in this step is not to write a story. Your task is to carefully analyze, internalize, and confirm understanding of the following narrative style and rules, because a second prompt will follow. Core style. You must write bleak, restrained, injustice-based historical narratives that feel like forgotten early American records. The tone must be cold, quiet, procedural, and oppressive. Avoid all cinematic language, inspiration, heroism, or dramatization. Do not romanticize suffering. Horror, if present, must come only from silence, authority, neglect, and bureaucracy. Historical rules. Do not modernize language, behavior, beliefs, or setting. Write as if the events genuinely occurred in early American history. Use only realistic American names appropriate to the era. Write only in clear, fluent English. Do not use digits, write all numbers in words. Narrative control. No supernatural elements. No emotional manipulation. No modern commentary. No symbolism-heavy or poetic language. Structure awareness. The final story will be written in 8 parts. Each part will be approximately 300 words, with flexibility if needed. Each part must slowly increase pressure without dramatic reveals. Important. Do not write anything yet. Do not ask questions. Simply acknowledge that you fully understand and are ready for the next prompt. Within weeks, the atmosphere of the city tightened. Soldiers appeared in greater numbers. Men spoke more openly of division. Clients cancelled appointments or rushed them, distracted by news from their home states. Elizabeth observed all of it without comment. Then one afternoon, the bell above the shop door rang with unusual force. The woman who entered did not pause to assess the room. She filled it immediately, skirts wide, movements abrupt. Her presence altered the air. Elizabeth recognized ambition before the woman spoke. She had seen it before, worn like armor. The introduction was brief, the request extensive, the expectation absolute. Elizabeth listened, measured, and agreed to attempt the work. She did not promise success. She never did. As the woman spoke of position, of appearance, of necessity, Elizabeth understood that this was not a single commission. It was an arrangement, one that would require discretion, endurance, and silence in quantities she had once been forced to supply without compensation. When the door closed behind the woman, the shop returned to its usual quiet. Elizabeth stood where she was for a moment longer than necessary, hands resting on the table. She did not yet know how much would be asked of her, nor how little protection she would be offered in return. She only knew that proximity to power carried its own dangers, and that once invited inside, departure was rarely simple. She extinguished the lamp, gathered her materials, and prepared for the next day. The work would continue, it always did. She slept lightly, as she always had, waiting for morning. The truth did not surface all at once. It never did. It emerged unevenly, through fragments and contradictions, through accounts that overlapped imperfectly and records that resisted alignment. By the time it began to appear with any clarity, the moment for intervention had already passed. Elizabeth Keckley experienced this surfacing not as revelation, but as pressure relieved in unexpected places. The war had ended, yet the atmosphere within Washington did not settle. Celebration faded quickly into reckoning. Attention turned inward. The urgency that had justified secrecy now demanded explanation. In the days following the assassination, the city moved as if stunned. Elizabeth watched from the margins as shock hardened into suspicion. Rumors formed before facts could organize themselves. Names circulated. Motives were assigned. The need for coherence outpaced the availability of certainty. Elizabeth was not permitted near the room where the president lay dying. She stood outside with others, listening for news that arrived in fragments. When the announcement finally came, it was not shouted. It passed through the crowd as a low murmur that grew heavier with each repetition. She returned to the executive mansion afterward, summoned not for work, but necessity. Mrs. Lincoln's grief was immediate and consuming. Elizabeth saw in it the same sound she had heard years earlier when another child had died. The difference lay in scale, not substance. Loss did not differentiate between public and private. In the weeks that followed, truth began to surface in pieces, often distorted by fear and accusation. Investigations were launched. Witnesses were questioned, papers were examined. Elizabeth observed from a position that offered no immunity. She was questioned once, briefly, about routine matters. She answered plainly, nothing more was asked. The larger truths remained unspoken, not because they were unknown, but because they were inconvenient. The nation required a narrative that could hold. Complexity threatened cohesion. Certain lines of inquiry were pursued vigorously. Others were allowed to fade. Elizabeth recognized this process. She had seen it before in smaller arenas. Institutions did not seek truth in its entirety. They sought stability. Mrs. Lincoln withdrew almost completely. Her fear of accusation intensified. She spoke of betrayal, of conspiracies that extended beyond what could be named. Elizabeth listened and recognized a woman anticipating judgment, whether deserved or not. It was during this period that fragments of truth surfaced through unintended channels. Receipts appeared in unexpected places. Correspondence was recalled imperfectly. Conversations remembered differently by different parties. Elizabeth did not initiate these disclosures. She simply witnessed their emergence. She saw how quickly accounts shifted once the president was gone. Individuals who had deferred to his authority now reinterpreted their positions. Decisions once framed as necessary were described as regrettable. Responsibility dispersed. Elizabeth's own role became a subject of curiosity in some circles. Her proximity to the First Family attracted attention she did not seek. People asked what she had seen, what she had heard. She deflected with practiced ease. Silence had become habit. The truth surfaced not through her, but around her. It appeared in court proceedings, in newspaper editorials, in private correspondence later made public. Each piece contradicted another, forming a mosaic that resisted definitive interpretation. Elizabeth watched as Mary Lincoln's reputation deteriorated. Accusations multiplied. Some were unfounded. Others rested on observable behavior stripped of context. Elizabeth recognized how easily grief could be reframed as guilt once sympathy waned. When Mrs. Lincoln asked her to assist with the sale of personal effects, Elizabeth understood the significance immediately. This was not merely a financial transaction, it was exposure. Objects carried history, they also carried evidence. Elizabeth agreed reluctantly, guided by obligation rather than confidence. The process unfolded slowly and painfully. Garments were catalogued, jewelry examined. Items that had once symbolized status were reduced to inventory. As Elizabeth handled these objects, truth surfaced in tangible form, notes tucked into seams, receipts folded into pockets, letters hidden within linings. Not all were significant, some were trivial, others suggested arrangements that had never been meant to leave the room in which they were made. Elizabeth did not collect these items, she did not copy them, she returned them to their places or followed instructions regarding their disposal. She understood that possession equaled implication. Still, she saw enough to confirm what she had long suspected. The patterns she had observed were not imagined, they were structural. The public response to the sale was swift and merciless. Newspapers seized upon the spectacle, sympathy evaporated, judgment replaced restraint. Elizabeth found herself drawn into this scrutiny by association. Her intentions were questioned, her integrity challenged. It was then that she chose to write. The decision was not impulsive. It followed months of accusation and silence. Elizabeth understood that her reputation would not survive unchallenged denial. She needed to defend herself, if only to preserve the possibility of livelihood. The book she produced did not reveal everything she knew. It could not. Some truths were too dangerous to articulate, others were too entangled with the reputations of the dead. What she wrote was measured, factual, restrained. She described her own life, her work, her proximity. She documented what could be corroborated. She omitted what could not be spoken without consequence. Even so, the response was immediate and severe. Institutions that had benefited from her silence now condemned her speech. She was accused of betrayal, of impropriety, of violating boundaries she had never been allowed to define. The truth had surfaced, but only partially. It was enough to provoke backlash, not enough to force reckoning. Elizabeth observed this outcome without surprise. She had not expected vindication. She had expected consequence. As the book was suppressed and her business declined, other truths continued to surface independently of her actions. Letters appeared in archives. Financial records were examined years later. Historians debated inconsistencies they could not fully resolve. Elizabeth remained silent. She watched as narratives hardened, as ambiguity became certainty in the absence of evidence, as complexity was flattened for convenience. The truth had surfaced, but it did not liberate. It unsettled, then receded, leaving behind questions rather than answers. Elizabeth understood that truth did not guarantee justice. It merely complicated denial. She returned to her work, diminished but intact. She did not speak publicly again about those years. She had offered what she could, the rest she carried. The truth had surfaced enough to mark her, not enough to protect her. That was its final shape.